Close your eyes for a second. Now picture believing, for 84 straight years, that you were born alone, an only child, a single thread, no twin, no brother, nothing but a mother who died before you could ever know her voice. Now picture finding out at 84 that the whole time a man who looked almost exactly like you had been living less than 400 miles away, believing the very same lie about you. That was Bernard Whitlow's entire life, right up until a Tuesday afternoon on a game show stage in Lubbock, Texas. Steve Harvey has hosted this stage for a long time. He has broken down exactly twice in 15 years. This was the second time. The first time, years earlier, involved a mother and a son separated by a war. This time, the story had been quietly building for 84 years before anyone in that building even knew it was happening. Family Feud tapes in blocks, 5 or 6 games a day, contestants cycling in and out in matching shirts, everybody rehearsing handshakes in the hallway beforehand. On paper, the Whitlow family's episode looked like any other. Bernard, 84, playing alongside his granddaughter Naomi and 2 of his great-nephews, all 4 of them in matching sage-green shirts Naomi had picked out weeks earlier. What nobody watching from home would have guessed was that Naomi had been planning this exact taping for 4 months, coordinating quietly with producers on details she had not shared with a single other member of her family, including her grandfather. She'd told Bernard only that the family had been selected for a taping and that it would mean a lot to her if he came along. He'd agreed without hesitation, the way he agreed to most things Naomi asked of him. She was, by his own frequent admission, his favorite grandchild, though he tried not to say that part around the others. Steve greeted the family warmly at the top of the show, the way he greets every family, no idea yet that this particular introduction was about to become the most consequential one of his career. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Whitlow," Steve said, shaking Bernard's hand. "Not much to tell," Bernard said, smiling easily. 84 years old, 1 daughter, 4 grandkids, and I still change my own oil. That's about the whole story. It was, Bernard believed completely, the whole story. He had no reason yet to believe otherwise. He'd lived a good, ordinary life by his own measure. 41 years as a high school shop teacher, a wife named Dottie who'd passed 6 years earlier, a house he'd built most of the cabinets in himself. If a person had asked him whether anything was missing from that life, he would have said no, honestly, and meant it. Across the stage, the Delgado family from Lubbock waited for their turn. 3 siblings and a cousin who'd entered through the regular casting line with no idea they were about to become a small footnote in the most talked-about taping the show would have all year. Bernard Whitlow was born in the spring of 1942 in a small hospital outside Macon, Georgia, one of a set of twin boys. Their mother, Eleanor, died 2 days after the delivery from complications nobody in that era had good answers for. Bernard's father, Thomas, a widower overnight with 2 infant sons and no family nearby able to help, made an impossible decision in the fog of that grief. One that a well-meaning nurse and a church placement worker helped arrange without ever fully explaining to him what it would mean decades later. Thomas had been a farmhand with no living relatives closer than 3 states away and a wife in the ground before he'd even had time to name both boys formally. The hospital records, once finally pulled, showed a man who had signed papers he likely never fully understood, exhausted and grieving in a system with very little patience for either. Thomas kept the older twin, born 9 minutes first. He was told the second boy had not survived the week. That was the story Bernard grew up with. A stillborn brother he never met, a grave he was told existed somewhere he'd never visited. A quiet sadness his father carried but rarely spoke of. Thomas remarried when Bernard was 6, to a kind woman named Ruth who raised him as her own, but he never had another biological child, and he never once, in the 60 years he lived after that spring in 1942, stopped keeping a small photograph on his nightstand. What Thomas was never told what nobody in that hospital ever corrected, was that the second twin had in fact survived. He'd simply been placed for adoption through the same church that helped arrange the burial story. A common enough practice in that era for families who could not manage 2 infants and no mother. That second boy grew up 400 miles away as Clifford Doss, raised by a loving family who adopted him at 6 weeks old and never fully knew the details of where he'd come from either. The Doss family had been told simply that the birth mother had died and the father could not care for the child alone, true, as far as it went, but missing an entire other half of the story. Both boys grew up as only children, in every sense that mattered to them. Neither one ever stopped wondering, quietly, what a brother might have been like. Clifford, for his part, had spent much of his own adult life volunteering with a Big Brothers program in Amarillo, a fact his own granddaughter would later find almost impossible to hear without crying, once she understood why he might have been drawn to it in the first place. He'd mentored 11 boys over 3 decades, always telling people it just felt like something he was supposed to do, without ever quite being able to explain why. Bernard kept one half of a photograph his whole life, a torn, faded picture of a young pregnant woman standing in front of a farmhouse, cut cleanly down the middle decades before he was old enough to ask why. His father told him it was the only photo that existed of his mother, damaged in a move. He never questioned it, not once, in 84 years, until his granddaughter Naomi asked to borrow it for a family history project 6 months ago. Round 1 went the way rounds usually go. Bernard answered a question about kitchen appliances, got it right, and did a small fist pump that made the audience laugh. Naomi's hands, though, hadn't stopped shaking since they walked out. She kept glancing toward the wings, toward a door that led backstage, toward a hallway only she knew held anything unusual behind it. 6 months earlier, curious about her family's history for a school project, Naomi had sent a DNA sample to a genealogy service, mostly for fun, expecting nothing more interesting than a percentage breakdown of which countries her ancestors came from. What she got back instead was a message flagged urgent, close family match, possible sibling relationship, attached to a name she had never heard in her life. Clifford Doss, age 84, of Amarillo, Texas. She'd nearly deleted the message, assuming it was some kind of scam, until she noticed the estimated relationship percentage. It wasn't a cousin. It wasn't an uncle. The math only worked one way. She sat with that message for 3 full days before telling anyone, terrified of what it might mean and equally terrified of what it might mean to say nothing at all. That wasn't the part of the afternoon that would end up mattering most. Not yet. Naomi had spent the last 6 months building a careful, quiet bridge between 2 families who had no idea the other existed. She'd found Clifford's own granddaughter through the DNA service's messaging system. Cautiously, terrified of destabilizing 2 elderly men's entire understanding of their own lives with a single wrong move. The 2 granddaughters had talked for weeks before either family knew anything. They compared notes, birth dates, hospital records requested from Georgia archives, the church placement paperwork that once actually read closely for the first time in 84 years, told a very different story than the one both families had always believed. They found the original hospital ledger page through a records request that took 11 weeks and 2 dead ends before finally coming through. It listed 2 live births, not 1, on the same April morning in 1942, a detail neither family's official story had ever included. Naomi photographed the ledger page the moment it arrived and stared at it for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to call anyone, the weight of 84 years sitting quietly on a single scanned document. Both grandfathers had kept half of the same photograph. Neither man had ever wondered why his half ended abruptly at a torn edge, right where a second child would have been standing beside their mother. When Naomi finally worked up the courage to test the theory, she asked Clifford's granddaughter, gently, careful not to explain why, to photograph her grandfather's half of an old torn picture of a pregnant woman in front of a farmhouse. The two photographs, laid side by side on a laptop screen at midnight, fit together seamlessly. Same tier, same farmhouse, same woman, smiling, one hand resting on a stomach carrying both of them at once. Naomi cried alone in her kitchen for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to call her mother. Both granddaughters agreed, independently and immediately, on the same instinct, this news could not be delivered over a phone call or a kitchen table. Two men who had spent 84 years believing themselves alone deserved to see it, not just hear it. Naomi had lost sleep for weeks over the decision to make it public at all, weighing the risk of overwhelming her grandfather on camera against the fear that if she waited for some quieter, more private moment, she might lose her nerve entirely and never follow through. In the end, it was something her grandfather had told her once, offhand, years earlier, that decided it for her. That the hardest thing about growing old was running out of surprises worth having. She wanted to give him one more. That was when Naomi called the show. What happened next, nobody in that studio was ready for. By round 3, Bernard's family had built a healthy lead, and Steve, glancing toward the wings for a cue from a producer, got the signal he'd been quietly waiting for since before the cameras rolled that morning. Naomi had reached out to the show directly, laying out the whole story in a 6-page email that had made 3 separate producers cry reading it in a conference room. The production team had spent the better part of a week quietly coordinating the logistics, flying Clifford and his granddaughter in 2 days early, keeping them in a hotel across town, briefing a skeleton crew on exactly how the moment needed to be handled so nothing felt rushed or staged. Steve himself had only been read the full story that morning, an hour before cameras rolled, and had reportedly needed a few minutes alone in his dressing room afterward before he trusted himself to run the rest of the day's tapings. He'd hosted plenty of reunions on this stage before, but something about the sheer arithmetic of this one, 84 years, 2 entire lives lived in parallel without ever touching, had gotten under his skin in a way few stories did anymore. Steve set his cards down. "Mr. Whitlow," he said, "I need you to indulge me in something. Can you come stand right here with me for a second?" Bernard, a little confused, stepped forward, glancing back at Naomi, who was blinking hard and not quite managing to hide it. "You told me earlier your mother passed young," Steve said carefully, "and that you had a twin brother who didn't survive. Is that right?" Bernard's easy smile faltered slightly, unsure where this was headed. "That's right. Never got to know him. Never even had a photo of him, if I'm honest." Steve nodded slowly. "What if I told you," he said, "that photo you've kept your whole life, the one of your mother, torn in half, isn't torn because of any accident. It's torn because there used to be a baby standing right next to her in that picture." Bernard went very still. "And what if I told you that baby didn't die that week like you were always told? What if I told you he's been alive this whole time, 400 miles from here, wondering the exact same things about you that you've wondered about him?" Bernard's mouth opened. No sound came out. The audience, sensing something enormous unfolding without yet understanding what, had gone almost completely quiet, leaning forward as one body. Even the Delgado family, still standing at their own podium waiting for a round that was clearly never going to resume, had stopped fidgeting with their buzzer, watching the moment unfold with everyone else. "Turn around, Mr. Whitlow," Steve said quietly. The back doors of the studio opened. An 84-year-old man walked through them, slow and careful with a cane, flanked by a woman who could only have been his own granddaughter, holding the missing half of a photograph in a small frame against her chest. Clifford Doss stopped 10 feet from his brother for the first time in 84 years, close enough now for 200 strangers to see. Plainly, unmistakably, the same jawline, the same set of the shoulders, the same nose neither man had ever had anyone to compare it to before. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped audibly at the resemblance before anyone had said a single word about it. Bernard's knees nearly went out from under him. Steve grabbed his arm to steady him without being asked. For a long moment, neither brother moved. Two men who had spent 84 years as only children stood 10 feet apart, staring at a mirror neither one had ever known existed. "I've got half a photo," Clifford finally said, voice breaking on every word, holding up the frame. "Never knew why it ended right where it did. Guess now I know." Bernard closed the distance in 3 unsteady steps and pulled his brother into an embrace that neither one of them seemed ready to end. The 2 torn photographs, pressed together between them, fit into a single, complete picture of a young pregnant woman standing in front of a farmhouse in Georgia, smiling at a camera she had no idea would still matter 84 years later. Steve Harvey, standing a few feet away, put his face in his hands. He didn't try to hide it, didn't reach for a joke to cover the moment the way hosts sometimes do when things get too big to carry standing up. He simply cried, openly, in front of 200 people and a room full of cameras that had captured him do this exactly once before in 15 years on this stage. The studio didn't applaud right away. For nearly a full minute, the only sound in the building was 2 old men crying into each other's shoulders and a room full of strangers crying quietly along with them. A crew member later said it was the longest stretch of silence she'd ever heard hold on a live studio floor, nobody quite willing to be the first sound to break it. When the applause finally came, it rose slowly, then all at once, the whole crowd rising to its feet together. Steve wiped his face, cleared his throat twice, and finally found words. "Let me tell you something," he said. 84 years. These 2 men lived entire lives, marriages, children, grandchildren, whole histories. Each of them believing they were the only one left of something that should have never been broken apart to begin with. And not one single day of those 84 years was either man's fault. He looked between the 2 brothers, still holding on to each other. A nurse made a call. A grieving father trusted people he had every reason to trust. Nobody in this story is the villain. Sometimes life just takes things from people, and it takes 84 years to give a little of it back. Sometimes the truth takes its whole life to catch up to you, Steve said. But it got here. That's what matters. It got here. Naomi and Clifford's granddaughter, meeting for the first time themselves in that exact moment, hugged each other like cousins who had somehow always known one another, because in every way that counted now, they had. Bernard's great-nephews, 12 and 15, stood off to the side taking in a moment they were still too young to fully understand the size of, though both of them would say later that they knew, even then, they were watching something they'd tell their own grandchildren about someday. Clifford's cane had fallen to the floor at some point during the embrace. Nobody bothered picking it up for several minutes. He clearly didn't need it just then. The Delgado family, still standing at their own podium, began quietly applauding too, one of them wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt, all of them forgetting entirely that they'd come here to compete against these very strangers an hour earlier. Steve gave the 2 brothers a long moment before speaking again, unwilling to rush a silence that clearly still had more it needed to hold. The game never resumed that day, and nobody in the building wanted it to. The 2 families spent the rest of the afternoon in a green room together, trading 84 years of stories in the space of a few hours. Favorite foods, old jobs, wives long past. Children raised an entire life apart without ever knowing a living uncle existed a few hundred miles away. They discovered, comparing notes, that both men had independently taken up woodworking in their 60s. Both had built the exact same style of birdhouse for their backyards, down to the pitch of the roof, without either of them ever seeing the other's work. Both had also, entirely independently, named a dog Rusty at some point in their lives. Small things. Silly things. The kind of coincidences that shouldn't have meant much on their own but landed, that afternoon, like proof of something neither man could quite put into words. Clifford's wife had passed 11 years earlier. Bernard's Dottie, 6, both men admitted, quietly, over coffee in the green room, that they'd each spent the last several years wondering who exactly they were supposed to grow old alongside now that the person they'd built a life with was gone. Neither one had expected the answer to be each other. The Whitlow family's original playing goal, $19,800. Money Naomi had intended to use to locate and finally mark their grandmother Eleanor's long unmarked grave outside Macon, was matched in full by the show once producers heard the whole story. 6 weeks later, both brothers stood together at a small cemetery in Georgia, watching a new headstone lowered into place for a mother neither of them had ever really gotten to know, but who had. It turned out, given them each other in the only way she still could. The headstone reads simply, Eleanor Whitlow Doss, beloved mother of Bernard and Clifford, together again. Both surnames, side by side, for the first time in 84 years. The restored photograph, fully whole for the first time in 84 years, now hangs in identical frames in both brothers' living rooms. Bernard and Clifford talk on the phone most evenings now. Neither of them, at 84, wastes a single one of those calls pretending they have all the time in the world left to say what they mean. They've already planned a joint birthday celebration for the spring, the first one either of them will spend with a brother in 85 years of living. Naomi is planning the whole thing. She says it's the least she owes both of them, and neither man has argued with her about it. The Delgado family, strangers an hour earlier, never got their game back that day either, and none of them seemed to mind. The eldest Delgado sibling later said watching two 84-year-old men meet for the first time put the whole afternoon's trivia questions into pretty simple perspective. Clips of the reunion circulated for weeks after the episode aired, viewed by more people than almost anything the show had posted that year. Genealogy Services reported a small, noticeable spike in test kits sold the following month, several customer messages specifically referencing the brothers on Family Feud. A local news station in Georgia picked up the story too, running a short segment on the unmarked grave records request that had helped confirm it all, prompting two other families in the same county to start asking similar questions about their own decades-old adoption paperwork. If today's story reminded you that it's never too late for the truth to find its way home, you already know what to do with that feeling. Stay close. Somewhere on this stage, there's always one more family whose whole world is about to change.
Spin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didan sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi Stargi tol kame badan shi صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي خمارو دې رنځور کړم سترګو خمارو دې رنځور کړم سترګو خمارو دې رنځور کړم اوس کله علاج مې په لندن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اسه به خراب د مینې خوان شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي دې برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه دې برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه دې برباد عبدل زرین کړما په आवाज د خالد شاه مې زړه پیوان شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي